This video is the second and final part of my 9 Nations of North America series. For those that didn't see the original video, this series is meant to look at the cultures, histories, anthropologies, and all that stuff of the different regional cultures in North America. Going clockwise, in the last video we covered the eastern parts of the continent, with New England, the Rust Belt, the South, and the Miami-Caribbean axis. Without further ado, and to not waste time, let's keep going and move on to the Mexican culture of the Southwest. History in America that can be covered, and much as I love reading, it's a very time-consuming process, and so in a lot of cases, I cook dinner or travel while listening to history books at the same time, and with Audible, that's possible. Audible's an app with a wide variety of content from audiobooks to podcasts and lectures, and I use this on a daily basis in real life and was just using it yesterday actually. Personally, I love the Great Courses, which have several really great lectures on American history, covering everything from the Civil War, politics after the Cold War, all available on Audible at very reasonable prices, and Audible's credit system is also very handy. Audible is something for everyone and is really easy to use. And as an Audible member, you get 1 free title for each month, regardless of its cost, which is a deal that I personally love. No matter what you're looking for, Audible is something for you. Audible is currently offering a 30-day free trial to anyone who signs up. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/whatifaultist or text whatifaultist to 500-500 and listen to whatever calls you today. Number 5. Mex America. When you're looking at this region, you're seeing a combination of a very radical divide and yet a lot of similarity. On one side, the difference between the US and Mexico is incredibly stark. The US-Mexican borderland is the borderland with the greatest difference in wealth between two countries of anywhere in the world. One side of the border is stable democracy, wealth, education, functioning courts, while the other side doesn't. There are a couple images like this that just make this so black and white and easy to see. However, in a lot of ways, this is a continuous area. On both sides of the border, people have the same ethnicity, fundamental culture, and the exact same kind of geography. Business of all kinds operates across the border on both sides, with American factories on the Mexican side, agriculture passing across in both directions, and drugs passing north illegally. The massive amounts of immigration means that this is a border that people cross all the time. Mexicans and Americans on both sides of the border are viewed as Mexicanized or Americanized by their co-nationals. In many ways, the border here is artificial, with the land and the people on both sides being the same. The only difference being governance, but at the same time, this is really a lesson on how much government can change a place. This dynamic reminds me a lot of the frontier between the Romans and the Germans in the ancient world. And before we continue, I don't mean this in any condescending, xenophobic sense of saying that the Mexicans are barbarians like the Visigoths. If anything, as a descendant of the Visigoths, I have immense pride in their culture. The Roman side of the border was populated by German peoples that were ethnically identical to those on the other side of the frontier, and both sides had exactly the same geographies. But in real terms, the differences were massive. On the Roman side of the border were good roads, strong centralized government, taxes, the rule of law, alongside things like aqueducts, cities, and had an imperial network stretching to Egypt and Syria. Although the differences are much smaller today, Mexico is run by cartels, much more violent, doesn't have rule of law, and stuff like electricity and education can't be taken for granted. At the same time, back in the ancient world, the German sides on the other side of the border were inextricably linked into the Roman economy and culture, with symbiotic trade relationships going across the frontier. In my video on American ethnicity, I said this region is both the oldest and the newest on the continent, and I still think that's the best way to view it. What I mean by that is that the first European settlements in the modern United States were by the Spanish, partially in this area. The Spanish established their colony in New Mexico at the end of the 16th century, conquering the local Pueblo Indians. If you want to push this area's history back even further, the Pueblo had a developed urban society for centuries before that, with amazing monuments like Chaco Canyon. They had a developed society with cities, mass planning, and complicated political religious structures. The Spanish were the first Europeans in the whole region along the Mexican border. However, in many ways it's easy to overemphasize their influence, given that these were extremely lightly populated regions that were very cut off and peripheral from the rest of the Spanish Empire. Before the US colonization, California and Texas, each areas that were incredibly fertile and roughly the size of France, had populations of 6,000 and 3,500 respectively. You have to keep in mind northern Mexico wasn't settled by this point, and so caravans would traverse hundreds of miles of empty desert once a year to reach Texas and New Mexico, while California was basically an island only accessible by water. These colonies were desperately poor, and in 18th century Texas, the governor literally lived in the jail, since it was the only sturdy building. I mean, the Spanish only really settled most of this area to prevent other Europeans from doing so. The Spanish established their colony in Texas so the French wouldn't settle it, and in California so the Russians wouldn't. You know, the Russians actually had a fort outside San Francisco in the 18th century. The native peoples in New Mexico and Texas, the Comanche and Apache, were also incredibly good warriors, and the Spanish were really fighting a defensive and losing war against them. The Spanish process of colonization worked here like it normally did across Latin America, with two major influences, the landowners and the church. The church showed up and serfed the local native populations that survived the Europeans' diseases, and then kept them in walled missions. This sounds awful, but the church was actually widely respected by the natives, since they had some degree of human decency versus the other Spanish group, the landowners, who just wanted to rape and enslave the local population. The Spanish were known for giving out massive land grants to local aristocrats, and this was more pronounced in Hispanic America than other parts of Latin America, where in California, single families often had land holdings that were larger than entire states in the Northeast, like Delaware, Connecticut, or Rhode Island. People normally put these lands under cattle, and the economies of Texas and California were entirely dependent upon ranching. This stagnant serf society couldn't compete with the dynamic Anglo-America, a very fast-moving country that doubled its population every 15 years and smashed across the whole North American continent from the Appalachians to the Pacific in just 50 years, settling the whole continent with Anglos. The US seized the northern half of Mexico in a very quick and easy war. Something that's incredibly interesting, actually, is that the Mexican aristocrats viewed the American conquerors as northern barbarians, who they often compared to the Germanic barbarians like the Goths or Vikings. As American settlers flooded into this region, they treated the local Hispanics really horribly. America was a deeply racist nation at the time, and in most cases, the Americans just stole land from the Hispanics. And since the Americans ran the government, they didn't protect the locals' land rights. Hispanics were dispossessed of political rights as well. The Americans had such demographic power that they became the majority in this region with a few exceptions. The Americans treated the Hispanics with a deep racist condescension that meant they adopted little of their culture. Part of me chuckled at when Joel Garreau referred to this region as Mex America in 1980, since at that time, California, Arizona, and Texas were still firmly Anglo-American and weren't really associated with Mexican culture by most Americans. Texas was populated by people from the southern states, while the counties along the Mexican border remained majority Hispanic. Southern California became majority Anglo and was interestingly enough populated by people from the Midwest in states like Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. Southern Arizona is similar, attracting people from the Midwest and the South. My mom's side's from Nebraska, and there was a mass migration to California, and so interestingly enough, the city in the world where I have the most distant relatives is Los Angeles. Los Angeles, for the first half of the 20th century, was known for being socially conservative, stuck up, and very Midwestern, which is kind of funny now. And I'm going to stop talking here about white Los Angeles culture, or that revolves around Hollywood, in a future section of this video, while I'm still going to talk about the Hispanic population in this section. New Mexico is the exception here, and the Americans never really wanted New Mexico. It had no resources, bad soil, and a large mestizo population they viewed with racism and condescension, but the US still annexed the area because it was in between California and Texas. New Mexico was anthropologically a colony, being the only state in the area that was never majority white Anglo and was always predominantly Hispanic or heavily native, and the ruling class was Anglo. New Mexico is the most Hispanic and also most native of the southwestern states. On the Mexican side of the border, the northern part of Mexico was colonized and settled by Mexicans in the late 19th century, defeating the local native tribes in long and bloody wars. Due to Mexico being dysfunctional, the train lines in North Mexico ran into the US rather than the rest of Mexico, meaning the area was very heavily influenced by American culture. The North Mexicans are viewed as more Americanized or individualistic and hustling than other Mexicans. In the Mexican Revolution, the leaders of most factions came from this dissatisfied border region, including the rebel warlord Pancho Villa, and a lot of what the Mexican Revolution was about was trying to break up the old aristocratic, command, hierarchical society with a more Americanized society, for lack of a better term. On a separate topic, you can't overestimate either the technological and social difference in America and Mexico in the early 20th century. In 1910, America was the most developed technological nation in the world, while almost all Mexicans lived a pre-industrial feudal existence as serfs under landlords who would whip and rape them. The whole Mexican borderland region was kind of economically irrelevant until the middle of the 20th century. Southern California was a subsidiary of San Francisco, and East Texas dominated West Texas. The area was dependent on ranching. However, you saw Southern California take off in the 20th century, in many ways driven off good weather, with Los Angeles becoming the second biggest city in the country and the West Coast big center. This was part of California's rise to predominance that makes sense given the state's sheer size, really fertile soil, and coastline. California geographically is really a winner. However, in the late 20th century, this whole area took off as part of the Sun Belt that was the big winner of that time. Arizona is an example, with Phoenix becoming the fourth largest city in America. Texas had a similar massive rise, becoming America's second biggest state in population and economy, driven in a lot of ways off oil. All these southwestern states made massive gains from the decline in the foundry, and people also just liked the warmer climate, and since it was so lightly populated, there weren't a lot of institutions to stop big thinking. So if you wanted to make a big project anywhere in the country, you would do it here. A very important restricting factor, though, is water, and that this region is really bone dry, and should not be supporting as many people as it has. If this area wasn't settled by the Americans, the greatest engineers since the Romans, who built massive aqueducts to carry water hundreds of miles, then it never could have supported cities like this. For Phoenix and Las Vegas, their water supply is very spotty, and I've seen a lot of smart people say this, and I don't know if it's true, but that this region is largely unsustainable and will see its depopulation over the next century. Anglo-America, coming from a culture where water is so abundant it's a problem, didn't really have good institutions to deal with water management in such a dry area, and so this region has massive water wastage and inefficiency. People grow cotton in Arizona, which is completely insane, given cotton is one of the most water-intensive crops ever, and it can grow just freely in places like the American South. California is similar, pulling massive amounts of water from underground aquifers or underwater lakes to power their farms in the Central Valley, one of the most fertile lands in the world, using really water-dense crops like tomatoes and vegetables, but also it's killing future generations' ability to use that aquifer water. Water is one of the biggest political problems in this part of the country, and states will fight tooth and nail over it. The big Anglo-American population boom that resulted in the settlement of this region occurred in the 19th century, but another one flowed from Mexico in the 20th century, when Mexico experienced massive population growth. Mexico now was overpopulated, and due to being corrupt and unstable, wasn't able to grow its economy as fast as its population did, meaning starting around 1980, a massive flood of Mexicans crossed the border into America. Drug cartels supplying drugs to the American market had also seized control of Mexico's government and society indirectly, creating a reign of terror of mass violence that often killed more people yearly than actual civil wars in the Middle East. This cheap Mexican labor was a big reason why this area was able to grow so fast. American authorities turned a blind eye since it provided cheap labor to undercut Americans for the American upper class. U.S. immigration policy is a massive clusterfuck since the right and the left can't agree on anything, thus creating the worst possible option of a massive illegal immigrant population in America, living hidden lives where they can't go to hospitals, use the police, or anything else. In many ways, drug lords and employers liked this better since it made them easier to exploit. This also resulted in a mass demographic shift in this region, one of the largest in history. In right-wing states like Arizona or Texas, this was still big, but they remained majority white Anglo. Meanwhile, in California, it was a population replacement. California went from being over 70% non-Hispanic white in 1970 to 35% today, and from 12% Hispanic to 40% Hispanic today. California has changed markedly as a state, in ways beyond this, becoming much more populated and left-wing in general. Keep in mind, this was a change that no one voted on, and the local population never consented to. This has resulted in a mass diaspora of white Anglos out of California to other states in the West. However, on the other side, Mexican immigrants have assimilated very rapidly. In cities that are over 70% Hispanic, with Spanish place names on the Mexican border like San Diego or El Paso, we're seeing Hispanics growing up not being able to speak Spanish, and their parents worrying that they'd turn out totally American. 40% of Hispanics marry non-Hispanics every generation, which is a massive benchmark for how assimilated a group is. The Hispanic birth rate is collapsing very rapidly, now being close to indigenous white rates, and they also learn English incredibly rapidly. We've seen Hispanics assimilate into local political cultures as well, with Hispanics in conservative states like Texas and Arizona voting Republican in higher and higher levels. I think this is since the US has just so much more dynamism and attractiveness as a culture than Mexico, that even if you stack all of the variables in favor of Mexican immigrants keeping their culture, they'll still pick to be Americans. If you compare Hispanic immigration to Islamic in Europe, the results are shockingly good. Hispanics are the hardest working element in America, and immigrants commit lower crime than the local American population. Mexicans have moved from having reputations as criminals and lazy to generally being pretty positive in America now, being seen as trustworthy and hardworking. Although I'd say importing over 20% of America's population in a 30-year period was a massive risk, it's a risk that really paid off well. Also, something a lot of folks don't know is that this migration from Mexico largely stopped 15 years ago in the 2008 financial crash. And as of now, more Americans immigrate to Mexico than vice versa. And you still see Guatemalans and Central Americans immigrate into America across the border, but this is a smaller issue than a lot of folks would think. On the Mexican side of the border, we've seen a lot of changes as well. You can't trust anything in the Mexican economy, government, or supply chain, but northern Mexico, as said before, is better attached to the US than it is the rest of Mexico. And due to the cheap labor, Americans build factories on the Mexican side of the border to import stuff to the US. This has made this region industrialized and the wealthiest area in Latin America, with cities like Monterrey, which is south of Texas, being Mexico and Latin America's industrial center. Going forward, I see the Americans and Mexicans to continue to cooperate since this whole borderland has become pretty populated and inextricably linked. As Hispanic Americans assimilate and become wealthier, I think they'll reach back and build relations with Latin countries that are positive. Meanwhile, as northern Mexico becomes wealthier, it will exert more influence upon the rest of Mexico, hopefully changing it for the better. Number 6. Echotopia. Although this region is geographically right next to Mex America, in a lot of ways, it's also the opposite. This area isn't diverse at all, being nearly as white as New England, with a couple Asians, and is extremely wet and temperate. Echotopia, over the Pacific Northwest, is a thin Chile-like band that hugs the Pacific coast from central California to Alaska, and in a lot of ways is its own very distinct cultural region like nothing else you'll find in the world. And it's really shocking that it only formed in its current state a couple decades ago, even though that regional culture is so confident and quintessential now. One of the things that makes a lot of sense once you explain it is that this region was populated by New England Yankees, with Portland, Oregon, for example, named after Portland, Maine, and it was actually a coin toss if it would be named Portland or Boston. After realizing this area's Yankee founding, you suddenly see the cultural similarities. It was, funnily enough, populated by Yankees who sailed the long way round South America to be whalers and sell furs to China in the North Pacific, and they became the dominant merchant class. New England gave this area its creativity, mechanical and merchant skill, as well as its moral self-righteousness. They were joined by a motley crew of other groups like the Scots-Irish from the Upper South, and with other European groups being Scandinavians coming across the North Plains, Germans, and especially Irish. The first settlers here at all were the Scottish, who were fur trappers who came over from Canada, and are the biggest influence on the Canadian side of the border. There was also a Chinese and Japanese population that came over in the late 19th century who were really horribly treated, in many ways worse than blacks in the South. The settlers that came here were in many ways a cutting edge of the kind of people who would just keep going across a continent until they hit the ocean. They were dreamers, doers, big thinkers, all on the positive side. As we'll see, all those things do come with negatives that would bear fruit. People initially came for resource extraction, whether gold in California or timber further north. The farmland here is also very fertile, but the early settlers, with the exception of Oregon, which was known for being incredibly down-to-earth and conservative, was that of a mining camp, or very rough and manly. San Francisco was the imperial capital, being the financial and economic center that dominated the West Coast during the 19th century. These areas largely existed as quiet and provincial until the late 20th century, when a massive cultural shift took place. As the foundry lost more and more of its predominance and influence and jobs moved outwards, you saw that region take advantage of its hustler creative spirit with the creation of the tech industry. Boeing in Seattle became a center for aircraft manufacturing, as well as Microsoft, and a couple other companies, and San Francisco became the global center for software production, with Silicon Valley changing the whole world in the course of history. This became one of the wealthiest places in the whole world. This large migration changed the culture of these areas. As they became wealthier, they also became more politically radical, as money allows you to escape the real world in a lot of ways. In the mid-20th century, these were areas that were pretty laid back and calm, and were very moderate between Republicans and Democrats politically. Hell, Oregon and Portland was also known for being extremely conservative, and was the most racist state outside of the South with highest KKK membership. However, since this region was creative, populated by dreamers, and operated in intelligence industries not connected to physical reality, you saw this also become a viciously left-wing place, the most so on the planet. Like its earlier wave of settlers, but in a different way, this area attracted dreamers and people who didn't get along with the rest of the country, including hippies, homosexuals, Buddhists, and other nonconformists. Because this area's culture was so recent, there was no precedent of a pre-established church or ideological structure. The good elements of this area's culture are creativity. The negative aspects are that they can become completely unhinged from reality, try to dream up utopias that are really impossible. To explain this area's ideology and worldview, I'm going to briefly go into its economics, which I think are a valuable lens to view it through. And by doing so, I'm going to compare it to my own area, the Foundry, which also went through its own phase of being the wealthiest area of the world. A difference to look at is that the Foundry did it over hundreds of years, gradually building up towards that wealth, and they did it with actual physical goods, managing factories and moving stuff around. Well, in this area, it was done entirely through immaterial things like information technology, and it happened in a 20-year period. And that massive amount of success through information and education technology meant that this area could imagine that it could achieve utopia very quickly without massive amounts of struggle. This area's utopian spirit, combined with it being the world's technological hub, means that if anywhere on the planet is going to colonize the solar system, develop robots, or do anything else spectacular, it's going to be here. This area isn't a predominantly Christian society. The ethic here is a strange wellness religion that combines a lot of New Age and Eastern customs, and the broader moral code basically boils down to judging people as wrong and you should just be chill. This area is dealing with the inability of traditional religions to relate to industrial populations and their religious decay by trying to just create something new, and I applaud them for their courage in doing so. However, the problem I see with a lot of the religiosity, if you want to call it that here, is that it lacks no clear boundaries and no clear structure without the ability to judge. And without structure, something has no meaning and automatically deviates back to the worst possible option. Like, how is manifesting different than praying, except there's no expectation of faith or goodness on your side? Or alternately, how is the New Age beliefs any different or any less irrational than traditional religions, except there's no moral judgment of you will be a good person or a bad person depending on whether or not you do this or that. It mostly seems to me like these are ideologies built around not offending anyone's feelings and not feeling hurt in any way, rather than any actual attempt at broader moral goodness. To make up some Wicca mother goddess cult that has no moral guidelines really just tells me that you have daddy issues and you're dating some beta male. As this area became wealthy so fast, so many things that started out as genuinely benevolent, good-willing attempts to improve the world morphed into being extremely performative and status-seeking because the dominant ideology of this area has no clear principles because it's so scared of judging. You can see this in people's desire to be environmental, going to stuff like paper straws or Teslas, stuff that really has negative or negligible effects upon the climate, while ignoring options like nuclear power that would actively improve the climate. Joel Garreau called this area Echotopia because this is an incredibly environmentalist area, in many ways filling a void what that used to be religion. And in many ways, this is caused by this area just being so beautiful, having some of those beautiful areas in the world with a very temperate climate that doesn't get either too hot or too cold. It's insane how left-wing the Pacific Northwest has become. To suggest even a centrist or Biden-left opinion is often a social death in San Francisco. Portland and Seattle have literally formed rebellious states last year. These are areas where leftism is institutionalized in the state governments and local governments. Leftism here is unhinged from applying any real principles to the world and is incredibly intolerant of any dissent. It's hard to overemphasize how much ideology affects this region right now, on every single level of society, whether people eat, how they talk, what they believe, what they wear, and everything. It's an attempt to form a new civilization. Due to its own indecision and class problems, it's unable to build more real estate, meaning this area has some of the most expensive real estate of anywhere in the world. At the same time, these cities, with San Francisco being a good example, are known for having horrible endemic homelessness and crime, simply due to the authorities being unable to maintain boundaries due to fear of using force being inherently immoral. The worst homelessness I've seen in the world is in Vancouver, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. I mean, Vancouver's policy to deal with their drug problem is to not judge at all or have any policies, just to have clean government rooms to shoot heroin in safely. Taxes and regulations are also high, meaning businesses are leaving at a rapid speed. In a lot of ways, this area is collapsing into decadence, and I think that's the case since their success came so fast in a field disconnected from real reality at a time of already high international social tension, meaning their society had no boundaries or principles, thus letting their creativity go really bad, and they had the money to take it in really insane ways. As a citizen of the Rust Belt, the conditions of ideologues seizing power in this region seem similar to the rise of the leadership class that killed my homeland, as mentioned in the previous video. This region's on track to see a similar social collapse as the Foundry, since when you get down to it, both regions have so much going for them, both in human and economic capital or geography, as just their leadership is unable to look at reality. I kind of feel bad just using this segment to go on a right-wing rant, and it shows a lot of my political biases, but at the same time, it is central to this area's culture, and it will be fascinating to see Echotopia develop in the future. Their culture is so built around the ideological high currents of today, kind of like New England was with the Puritans, and when social justice inevitably self-implodes due to its own foolishness, they'll have to develop some new way to justify their existences. They will either overreact in another direction, which is kind of like how they went from being KKK to social justice, or like Germany after World War II, or like the Puritan New Englanders after religious fanaticism was no longer acceptable in the Western world, choose some other god to direct their energies towards. Considering this area's creativity, I wonder if they just found a whole new religion with really different tenets, and I'd be really fascinated to see that. Intermission. Exceptions and city-states. These are the areas Joel Garreau marked out as being special enough they needed to be covered in their own section. The city-states, though, are powerful enough to be distinct from their own countrysides. The weird enclaves and the like. I'm going to use the ones Joel Garreau has, and I added a couple myself for cultures that have deviated a lot over the last 40 years. The first is New York City. New York has always functioned as a city-state since colonial times, where the Dutch established it as a fur trading center while the rest of New York State was largely settled by Puritan Yankees. New York has kept its character since colonial days, and if a neighboring American wrote a criticism of New York City in both the year 1700 and today, it would largely say the same thing. New Yorkers have always been very financially skilled in hustling, possibly the most so of anywhere on the planet. They've always imagined themselves to be the center of the world and a world city, which in some ways they are, and it's always been a very multicultural region, with the highest concentrations of immigrants throughout basically all of American history of almost anywhere in the country. In the colonial period, they were Black, Swedish, French, Dutch, then it became Irish and German, then Jewish, Italian, Polish, and now Puerto Rican, African, Chinese, Pakistani, and about 20 others. A big reason New York is culturally separate from the Rust Belt is just very different ethnic makeup, where, for example, Jewish and Italian Americans are heavily concentrated in this region. New York has been incredibly diverse since day one, and the ethnic groups all live in separate enclaves that coexist, but not especially liking each other. New York's always been open to any idea that makes money, and so is incredibly creative, but lacks the West Coast's open skies creativity since it's also a very materialistic society. The rest of America views New York with suspicion as not really American and sociopathic, while New York views literally everyone else as hicks. Well, they themselves cram into apartments that make horse stalls look generous, but it's still the center of Western civilization. When something happens in the world, New York either created it or is the first on top of it. Washington, D.C. is a very recent culture. It was a small town until World War II, which is when the U.S. government grew massively. Washington is different from the other cities in the East Coast for this reason, and it honestly gives off California or Florida vibes in some ways by being so recent and settled in that era by a mix of peoples from all over America. Washington is a city of bureaucrats, people who focus on their specialty and work hard but can't see the bigger picture or are very imaginative. Toronto is both the Canadian Washington, D.C. and New York combined, even though Canada's real capital, Ottawa, is a much smaller city. Canada is in many ways a colonial economy, even today, based on exporting raw materials outwards, and it's a much more hierarchical society culturally than America, so Canadian corporations and corporates come across as bureaucrats since it's a society with less initiative. If America is based on the principle of freedom, Canada on the principle of order, and you see those distinctions everywhere. Toronto is heavily deviated from the foundries culture, and at Joel's time, it really was part of that, but since it's imported a truly massive amount of immigrants. In Joel's time, Toronto is known for being incredibly uptight Scottish Presbyterian, but now a majority of the population speaks English as their second language, with massive amounts of Asian immigrants forming the majority population. I also have to say the Asian immigrants have done a wonderful job here, assimilating rapidly, being very hardworking, educated, and committing low crime and just being perfect citizens. The final city-state being the white Anglos of Los Angeles. Los Angeles' culture has changed a tremendous amount. At the middle of the 20th century, it was an uptight Midwestern WASP society, and this has changed through the rise of the film industry. This is really the nexus upon which all of LA's dominant culture forms. There are two things to understand at the film industry in order to see LA's culture. The first being that it was made by outcasts from the WASP-dominated theater industry in the Northeast, or Jews, Catholics, homosexuals, and socialists, who went to the other side of the country and felt immense bitterness at their rejection from the dominant society. This is why Hollywood culture holds Protestant values in scorn, and supports partying, sexual liberation, and the like to be moral goods in of themselves. Also, actors being the people who they are tend to like all those things. The second being the sheer cost and unity and cooperation required to make a Hollywood movie, which is more akin to managing an army than making any other kind of art like a painting or a book. This means that large amounts of money need to be concentrated and dispensed, and since there's very little objective measurement on what's good or bad in art, it creates an environment like a Renaissance court of jockeying for influence and pleasing social elites. This is where LA's culture of being fake comes from. You can trace every piece of LA culture from this court environment, whether it's feminine nature of heavy emphasis on beauty or being calm and chill, since women are always the ones that dominate courts across history due to their strong interpersonal skills, and also women's beauty being very important for the screen. Alternately, how important having the right opinions on social signaling or materialism is, since being liked is dominant across court politics. This LA culture is decadent now, as the medieval historian Ibn Khaldun could have easily predicted, since institutions take 120 years to become decayed and decadent, and Hollywood was made 120 years ago. With Hollywood today putting out movies like Terminator 13 again and again, not making any art, or the city being filthy, crime-ridden, and the like. If you had to get a person to paint a picture of decadence and describe the definition of a decadent situation, it would be the exact same as modern Los Angeles. Again, expect declines in Southern California in the coming decades like what we have seen in the Rust Belt. The amount of people I know who are leaving California right now is just completely shocking. And the shocking thing again is that the Californian elite seems to be completely oblivious to this, thinking that it's never happening and that California remains the greatest place in the world. And you know a situation will collapse when the elite is totally unable to see the reality of its own decay. And it's something I've seen in the Rust Belt, where the Philadelphia elite is still unwilling to say that the area has declined over the last 60 years. Number 7, the empty quarter. This part of the country is really what blows people's minds about America. The sheer open space and the size of the mountains and deserts, and their sheer beauty is truly awe-inspiring. It's impossible to not see the truly stupendous beauty and mystery of the universe when out in the Rocky Mountains. It's almost too stunning to be real. However, in this realm of the gods, a handful do eke out existences, small enough that Joel Garreau refers to this region as the Empty Quarter, a term he took from the area of Saudi Arabia where the oil comes from. For some perspective on how empty this area is, the island of Manhattan has 3 times the population of Wyoming, a state larger than the majority of nations in Europe. The Empty Quarter is a truly massive region between the Pacific coastal plain and the Great Plains. Joel has it extend up into the Canadian Arctic, but realistically the north of Canada is mostly inhabited by very culturally distinct indigenous peoples. However, it is fair, in my opinion, to put them in the same area, since, say, if oil was discovered in the Canadian Arctic, it would take up the same culture like Alberta to man the oil rigs. And we see this in Alaska having a very similar culture to states like Wyoming or Montana. The Empty Quarter's reason to exist is resources. The region is so dry and inhospitable that very little can grow in it, but people congregate wherever there's something to be pulled out of the earth, whether silver in Nevada, copper in Montana, or oil in Alberta. You get some clever areas like Las Vegas that figured out a trick like gambling to bring people in. And agriculture does exist in places where it can be irrigated, especially in Oregon and Washington. The land's so formless that in many areas like Wyoming, the railroad companies built towns every 100 miles regularly just to have stops, and the towns formed around these railroad stops. There are 2 very different ethnic groups in this area, so different that I don't really like to count them as the same region, but dividing them up looks really, really ugly, and those 2 groups being the Mormons, and as they call literally everyone else, the Gentiles. The Mormons are a religion that was founded in upstate New York in the 1820s by a certain Joseph Smith, and they say they're Christian, but some of the things they believe are that Joseph Smith is the next prophet, that Jesus came to America and converted the Native Americans before European colonization, that caffeine and sugar are sinful, that you have to wear the church's special brand of underwear, or that you save your soul by figuring out your ancestral chi and then retroactively baptizing your ancestors, that everyone is a special planet and space given to them by God, and that in the future they will save America from a world crisis. They also practiced polygamy until 100 years ago. The rest of America tends to view them with either disgust as not being real Christians, or being too patriarchal and conservative on one side, but also viewing them as kind, hardworking, upstanding Americans, which they really are. Joseph Smith formed a group of New Englanders to create a new Mormon utopia, and that group was bumped west until it decided to migrate to Utah around the Great Salt Lake in the 1840s, becoming the majority group and turning Utah into a theocracy. In the 50s, for example, the Mormon Church controlled a truly vast percentage of businesses in Salt Lake City, the capital. Almost all government officials were Mormons, alcohol was banned, and even today a majority of Utah's population are members of the Mormon Church. A way this area's geography works, and the Mormons are part of this, is that it's very easy to create insular, locally focused, kind of strange groups in this area because it's so separated from the rest of civilization. A lot of these towns are hundreds of miles away from any other habitation. For example, the northern part of Idaho is the white supremacist capital of America. The Mormons are fascinating to watch in this vein since they're a way of creating a white Anglo society that can deal with geographic conditions like the Middle East by becoming like a Middle Eastern theocracy. Like the Middle East, the Mormons are irrigation farmers with a water system controlled by the church. The church literally issues orders on what Mormons do. The settlement of much of the West was done like a strategy game in which the Mormon temple would order people to settle in certain areas to populate them for the broader Mormon church's strategic goals. The Mormons have populated much of the neighboring states of Idaho, Wyoming, Arizona, Nevada, and even California in this manner. The Mormons were instrumental in creating Las Vegas and its gambling industry, for example. The rest of the population, the Gentiles, are a motley crew of people who happen to end up here. The area has a strong cowboy culture, or individualistic, self-reliant, freedom-loving, and the like. You meet a lot of the coolest and most interesting people in the world in this area since they appreciate the beauty of the world in their own company rather than social climbing. At the same time, this is one of those deadeningly boring areas of the country because you're just stuck in small towns that are completely isolated from the rest of the world. Alongside of these Gentiles, there are sizable Hispanic population and larger than elsewhere Native American populations. The largest group of white ancestry is of British origin, which is generally the case across all of America, but you have other groups of Germans, Scandinavians, Irish, and lots of strange populations that ended up here due to the geographic situation like the Basques or the Cornish. The main story in the settlement of this area is the railroads, in which this area's settlement was dominated by the railroads that were the only way to bring goods in and out, which brings us to the next key point of tension in this region, economic exploitation. Politically, this area is mostly right-wing, except Colorado, due to its individualistic streak, but these two really aren't that different. Like, Colorado leftism is more down to smoke weed and protect the environment than it is to fundamentally alter the tenets of Western civilization. And for the right-wingers, they're more libertarian, where they'd often be down to smoke weed and support gay people. People in this part of the country love nature, but also want growth and want to be left alone. Due to the light population density, the companies that control the railroads and mining were able to rule a lot of these states dictatorially, horribly abusing the local populations. For example, the railroads would charge unfairly high freight costs to ship things to this area on a pretty arbitrary basis in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Anaconda Copper Company ruled Montana, actively preventing the growth of other businesses to maintain power and resulting in the state having active population decline over much of the 20th century. Alaska in the early 20th century was totally dependent on trade through Seattle, in which the Seattle merchants exploited it. This sort of thing results in massive bitterness on the parts of the local population. This is a region with fitful population growth dependent upon resource extraction. In the early 20th century, when the whole US's population was growing at a truly massive clip, mountain states like Montana or Nevada were experiencing active population decline due to resource prices being low. Meanwhile, Alaska and Alberta are some of the wealthiest places in the world due to their resource, oil, being consistently very valuable. The dependence on resources and lack of critical mass population means this area is kind of stuck in a lot of ways. In many ways, it's so lightly populated that smart people don't have a lot to do and so just leave. This isn't an area with a pressure cooker to get stuff done, since there's no water to both figuratively and literally boil. This area has its own kind of desperate poverty, where there's just not real work or anything to do, and lots of times people see the beautiful lands around them and feel bitter that there's no way that they can make money, and they're stuck in a trap of such a beautiful yet boring place. There are three regions that are exceptions: Las Vegas, Colorado, and Alberta. Each figured out a gig to maintain their population. For Las Vegas, it's obvious. It's a sin city with prostitutes and gambling, and is close enough to Los Angeles to feed off it. Colorado is the wettest state in this area due to the rain shadow effect and has been the center of this region since the 19th century. Colorado has seen mass migration just due to how beautiful and laid back and nice a place it is to live. Finally, Alberta is one of the most important places in Canada since it's been able to use its oil money wisely to build up the rest of its society. Alberta is thus the youngest place in the whole Western world and has a lot of dynamism going forward. This is an area that in a lot of ways exists out of history, and that the mountains have been there for millions of years and stay the same while we humans build a couple houses and have some ranches. This area isn't looking like it's poised for the next revolution, but I could see, say, in an era in which remote work became much bigger, people moving into this area since so many Americans want to move to the mountain states. It reminds me of something Joel Garreau said, where he was talking to people in Wyoming on why they wanted to build factories. Joel said, in summary, you know the thing that makes your area special is that you haven't developed factories. And New Jersey, which does, is really ugly, and it's really sad the way it is. Are you going to lose what makes your area special? To which the Wyoming people replied that they had so much space they could afford to live some, and they had to live in the poverty of their area. This is the struggle of living in the land of the gods, in which you must despoil it a little to live a good life, but also not drive its beauty from the earth. I guess when you get down to it, that's the balance of all of human life. When to despoil things and sell out, and when to stick to your values and hold the sacred.
Number 8. The breadbasket.
Since my speciality is the Middle Ages, whenever I see a grassland, I imagine Mongols and Huns coming out of it to despoil the civilized world. Although the American Great Plains did have a microcosm of that with the Comanche and Sioux and all those tribes, it shocks me today to see an area of hard-working and peaceful farmers. This area was populated in a very rapid period of a few decades after the U.S. Civil War. Originally, people hopped over this region, ironically the most fertile farmland in the world, and walked to the west coast, but a handful of inventions allowed this land to fill up, thus becoming the greatest agricultural land in the world. These were a new kind of plow to farm the soil, since initially the soil was so fertile it would break plows, the second being barbed wire to keep cattle from eating crops, and then well systems to pump out water from underground aquifers. Beforehand, this area was inhabited by cowboys who would lead their herds of cattle across the Great Plains and then take their herds of hundreds of cows to eastern cities like Kansas City or Omaha to be slaughtered and sent to markets in the eastern states or Europe. Although cowboys have become a quintessential part of American character, they only really existed for 20 years. The farmers then started showing up, boxing up land so there wasn't any for the cow, and the cows were pushed west into drier climates in the high plains or the desert. Ranchers fenced in their water sources for the cows to drink from, and the ranchers that couldn't do that became employees of the ones that could. One of the most famous American musicals is Oklahoma, and it's about the dynamic in the territory of Oklahoma at around the year 1900 when it became a state, which is actually an era I had ancestors in. And there's this whole song and dance about, oh, the farmer and the cowman can be friends, about how the farmers are taking land from these cowmen, and the cowmen hate it. And I always found it amusing because across history, the vast norm is that the cow people just kill the farmers, rape their women, and take their land. But now it's the opposite dynamic. This area is very starkly geographically divided at the 100th parallel between the prairie plains in the east that are wet and you can just farm on rainfall, and the high plains in the west where water is much, much more scarce. And you basically farm whenever you can get a stable water source. Fluctuating rain patterns have massive effects on if farms fail or succeed in the high plains, and this line at the 100th parallel is so important because before it you see genuine continuous human settlement and trees, and west of it everything becomes significantly more sparse. An interesting part of this is that the rainfall was unusually high in this area's settlement from 1870 to 1930, and there was this theory that rain followed the plow, or as areas became farmed they also became wetter, and that's what happened as areas further west became wetter right as he started to farm them. In 1930, meanwhile, this trajectory totally changed, and a dry period followed, which meant that there were lots of farms operating in areas where they shouldn't have in the first place, thus resulting in a mass migration to the west coast from failed farmers. My family's from Nebraska, and for this reason, I have lots of relatives on the west coast. This profound drought in the plains was called the Dust Bowl, and was really destructive of the local economy. This area in a lot of ways has never recovered from the Dust Bowl, and today has a population 1/3 lower than it did in 1920. The population in this region is almost entirely white, but it has large immigrant communities. The northern areas like Minnesota, the Dakotas, and the like are incredibly high Scandinavian and German ancestry, being by far the majority of the population. Meanwhile, the Canadian side of the border is a large Ukrainian and Eastern European population, who the Canadian government brought in so that the area wouldn't get populated by Americans. German ancestry is very large throughout the whole region, and you see a larger British population in the southern plains. Due to being white rural populations, this area is universally conservative. Minnesota and Iowa used to be exceptions since they had large Germanic populations that stood for unions and community values, but as the Democrat Party has moved away from unions, so they've also tilted right. Agriculture is the thing upon which everything else centers in this area. This is the most productive agricultural region in the whole world, feeding much of the planet, and in these states it's just endless miles of farmland, covering an area the size of Western Europe. Interestingly enough, a big causer of the Arab Spring was a drought in this area that raised the global wheat price. Based on local geographic variables, you see different belts of farmland built on different kinds of agriculture, whether corn, soy, wheat, etc. The agriculture here has been centralized in the hands of wealthy farmers who get control of thousands of acres, which use the most modern agricultural methods in the world to get tremendous degrees of efficiency through their machines. As much as people on the coast like to lambast these cities as being hicks and backwards, that's not true. These are the states that score the highest in Human Development Index and in a bunch of metrics like low crime, good education, or a good standard of living. Joel Garreau said this was the best of the 9 nations, and I think that's a plausible argument. People say really good things about cities like Minneapolis or Kansas City. This area has a good amount of industry to balance out agriculture and has respectable universities. Due to being so homogeneous and having the right balance between not a lot of people and too many, this area is just a quiet, pleasant place. In other words, it's a great place to raise a family but can be terribly boring. This area is torn between individualistic cowboy tendencies, but also the northern parts of this area are some of the most communitarian and collectivist of anywhere in America due to the German and Scandinavian heritage. This area, like the Empty Quarter, has also fought against external exploitation by big companies, the big railroads, and big agriculture. And so, because of trying to fight that, this is the center of old-timey, OG American populism and progressivism. Williams, Jennings Bryan, and La Follette, the OG populists, were from Wisconsin and Nebraska. Over the last couple decades, we've seen the rise of inequality also manifest in this region, with a stressful process where big farmers ate little farmers, shutting down factories and declines in social cohesion from their highs in the mid-20th century. However, this area hasn't seen the same dispiriting collapse as the Rust Belt, because it never went as all-in industry as the Rust Belt did, with most industry here being driven around their agricultural sector. This is a region that's been walking along doing its job, hasn't experienced insane highs like Mex America or lows like the Rust Belt. I don't see the insane growth of other areas in the future, but it's positioned pretty well for anything that can happen due to everything it has going for it. This area has already benefited disproportionately from the reindustrialization seen due to the trade war with China. Number 9. Quebec. Now for the final of the 9 rings to rule them all, nations of North America, before we circle back to New England, possibly the strangest to be honest, and one that Canadians like myself often have on our minds. This is the one nation that today views itself the most as a nation, and it literally issued a proclamation in the last year saying they are a nation, that being Quebec. For those that don't know, Quebec is the very culturally distinct French province of Canada. It was settled from between the early 17th century and mid-18th century by people from the northwestern regions of France like Brittany and Normandy. The French didn't export people in the same way the British did to their colonies, and so in 1750, New France had a population of 70,000, while the British colonies had 3 million. This was a very peasanty society, for lack of a better term, and one that was dominated by the Catholic Church and the landlords or seigneurs, who formed the new aristocracy. This was a society where people generally farmed and kept their heads down. French Canada was very interesting, being the center of the fur trade and having a badass level of contacts and explorers who created a sphere of influence spreading out to the Rockies, the Gulf of Mexico, and Hudson Bay. The French built countless cities in Middle America like St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, Louisville, and the list could go on. This empire of trade and Indian allies was based out of Quebec. The British conquered this region during the French and Indian Wars in the 1750s and thus subdued Quebec. Interestingly, after this, the British cut a deal with the nobility and the Catholic Church which kept Quebec's loyalty for centuries afterwards. The British kept political power in exchange for giving the French-Canadian elite total social power. The Quebecois weren't very skilled merchants, so the merchant class, based out of the largest city, Montreal, were Anglo. In the new Canada that formed, the Anglo ruling class based out of Montreal was in a lot of ways the pan-Canadian ruling class, and the original capital of Canada was Montreal, but they later moved it to Ottawa, on the border between Ontario and Quebec, just because Montreal had too many entrenched Quebecois interests that made it difficult to establish a pan-Canadian unity there. The Quebecois have always had immense resentment about having their dominant merchant class being Anglo and being ruled by the English for so long, and view it as Anglo oppression. And in some ways, the Anglos did oppress the Quebecois. But also, to be really fair, Canada has been having French-Canadian prime ministers since the 19th century, and the area has had political equality and power. The repression has been mostly economic, and even then the Quebecois had little inclination to merchant to compete with the English. The Quebecois like to claim that they're the blacks of Canada, and I don't think that's especially fair. Quebec kind of fell asleep until the 1960s. The life of a Quebecois peasant changed very little, and the Catholic Church totally dominated the society, meaning it never went through the Enlightenment or later social revolutions. It's sort of shocking that the Quebecois stayed in their province while they totally had the ability to expand west, but all the provinces to the west of Quebec were populated by the Anglos. Then, starting in the 1960s, Catholicism died extremely rapidly in Quebec, with it becoming a pretty agnostic society. Instead, leftism and political radicalism replaced Christianity, as often happens. The Quebecois became very nationalistic and have since been doing a lot to fix the Quebecois nation. There were all sorts of French nationalist measures like demanding all government things be done in only French. Like if you call 911 in Quebec, they must answer you in French, even though a significant percentage of the population is English-speaking. The Quebecois government also released a statement saying they are a nation, which is a slap in the face in many ways to the nation of Canada. The Quebecois pushed cultural nationalism and blackmailed Canada with threats of secession. Quebec used to have a much more significant English-speaking population, a majority in many areas, that has since migrated out because it can't deal with the French nationalism. Quebec has nearly seceded twice over the last century, with both times being pretty close referendums. Talk to an Anglo-Canadian, they'll be tired of how Quebec is the problem province, where, for example, the Canadian government transfers them large amounts of money every year so they won't secede. The exception of this is the bilingual Ontario Laurentian elite, but that's a totally different story. There's a Quebecois saying that the Chinese and the cockroaches and the Quebecois will survive anything. And I see that. I think going forward, the Quebecois will do what they always do, being an island of French speakers surrounded by Anglos, trying to take their independence and identity. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pearl, Pillar, or Patreon. As always, thanks so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.